That's the good stuff right here. Hard, soft literature. Yeah. I mean, sort of, kind of. I tell you what, I'll check it out. You know, I'm not normally one to destroy books, but so I'm just kind of big for it. Hiya, folks, Written Doggy here, and I'm here to discuss this mystery book, Monet Talks, and it probably won't show up here at the bottom, but it is a Den of Antiquity mystery series by Tamar Myers. And I wasn't exactly positive of this when I first looked at it, but it turned out to be quite a few books into a series, which I'll have to admit, this didn't really help that. This list of books puts the book in question, Monet Talks, up at the top. I'm going to try to change this up in editing, but I have never seen that before, except sorry, let me rephrase that. Whenever I see excuse me, a series of books that have been published by the same author like that before, it's almost always chronological from earliest to most recent. But in this case that doesn't turn out to be the case at all. So I'm really not happy how this book did that, but it is what it is. And between all my coughing, I'm not sure if I already mentioned this, but this was published in 2005. It's not quite a full 15 years old yet, and it's 325 pages long. Sorry, excuse me. I'm just going to read a quick summary of the book. For the birds, Charleston antiques dealer Abigail Timberlake Washburn is thrilled by a recent estate auction purchase of a spectacular bejeweled birdcage from India, but not so much by its occupant, a mouthy mina named Monet. Still, her customers at the Den of Antiquity seem charmed by the insufferable bird brain, so Abby figures she's stuck with them. That is, until she finds a stuffed starling resting on its usual perch with a ransom note demanding a real Monet, the painted variety, in exchange for her purloined pet. Since she doesn't happen to have a priceless masterpiece on hand, and since a minerless existence isn't all that distasteful a prospect, Abby figures she'll let the thief keep the annoying avian. But when her mama Mozella, not mozzarella, Mozella, is abducted by the craven bird napper, Abby must leap into the fray to rescue mater and mina alike before the feathers really start to fly. And I will mention that despite what the cover shows or possibly suggests with the cat, this is not a book series or a series of mysteries that involves a cat as a protagonist and ally. I'm not really sure why there's a cat there at all. I mean, I guess just part of the cover art with the skull pattern, but there's literally nothing to do with a cat whatsoever, so I thought it was kind of an odd choice after reading the book. And I will admit right off the beginning that this book, it was okay, but I wasn't really enthralled with it as much as I was hoping for. Excuse me. And I have to admit, part of that stems from the fact that the protagonist and her friends, her social network, everybody that makes up the main cast, they're all fairly well-to-do. And I'm not one to begrudge anybody's success, especially when it's a fictional character. But I really felt it really seemed hard for me to relate or connect to the characters in this story, because money was really not a concern for them in the same way it would be for most people. She goes out to eat at expensive restaurants fairly frequently throughout the story. It takes place over several days, and she doesn't think twice about blowing money on, expensive drinks, wine, treating herself and others to ritzy meals. And again, I think it's interesting that she's a business owner, that she runs an antique shop. I'm not hip on antiques. I'm not knowledgeable about them, but I definitely have a soft spot and appreciation for antiques, to some extent at least. Excuse me. But she's not a struggling business owner. She's comfortable. She doesn't have to worry too much about a miss here and there. And I feel like I'm belaboring the point, but the only conflict comes from when her mother is kidnapped, and there's this whole question and mystery about who's doing this, what's their motivation, what's going on. But everything else in her life is more or less perfectly fine and dandy, with no real hiccups or problems, just kind of goofy friends and some interesting characters that she gets to interact with, and again, her life is otherwise charmed. And I do admit that, how to put it? Excuse me. Compared to other mysteries, I think this one had a reasonable balance. The mystery element, the problem was at the forefront. She kept working at it. She kept trying to talk to different people, suss out any sort of motivation and clues. Yeah, she knows that somebody wants a Monet, in theory, but how does that connect to the bird and the bird cage? She bought the bird cage in an auction, but that doesn't mean that she has a rare painting. She doesn't. And so it's kind of trying to figure out what in the world is going on. And this would be spoilers to a small extent, but by the end, it basically just turns out to be a huge misunderstanding, which is taken to a lethal and kind of a dark humor turn. And I don't want to give away everything, but in essence, the villain, the kidnapper, is kind of a bumbling buffoon, and they basically just screw the pooch from beginning to end, and it's just stupid. I keep saying stupid. I apologize for that. I'm blaming my stupid cough that keeps driving me crazy. I think it's making me a little surly. But anyways, I thought that the villain, the kid, I don't know, villain almost sounds like a bit of an overstatement, all things considered. But the kidnapper, they screw things up so badly that it just kind of becomes a comedy of errors to an extent, where it's like, oh, so all this could have been headed off at the very beginning and headed off at the pass if there just hadn't been this big mix-up. Because it turns out a whole lot of people were interested in this bird cage when she bid for it, and they all had different reasons and motivations, and it basically amounted to, it's kind of a work of art, it's an interesting piece. That's it. It was just something that people liked. I think one person had a mindset that they could turn around for a nice profit, but otherwise that was really it. I will admit that the protagonists, their personality, they were okay, but they could be somewhat spurious. I don't know, they almost seemed kind of childish, because they would make a snide remark and then dart off before the other person could respond. And that happened more than once, and I thought that was just kind of weak. I wouldn't expect that from the protagonist. It's one thing to hit somebody upside the head with a, ooh, that's a good burn, that was a good, touche. You've outjeweled me in that verbal spar, that verbal interaction, but when they drop a snotty comment and then just flit away, it makes them seem like more they're a teenage girl having a tiff with one of their rivals or something. I don't know. I thought that was a little I already have kind of rehashed that point at this point, but I've already rehashed that point by now, so I'm just going to leave it at that. But I just would expect a little bit more from a protagonist, and I suppose some people might find that to be a good comedic effect, but it just doesn't come off that way to me. And I will mention that somebody on the back cover says, Myers has a wild and wicked humor by the Charleston Post and Courier, and there's some aspects that are clearly put in for comedic effect, but it just wasn't my sense of humor, so it just didn't really work out for me. And I did drop this point earlier about the mystery aspect. I thought it was at least a positive that the mystery was at the front and foremost of the story, that it was being pursued all the way through. It wasn't just being dropped hit and miss, like being pushed off to the side in favor of other plot elements. But again, with the kidnappers bumbling, I think the fact that the kidnapper bumbled so much made it more difficult to figure out who they were. I didn't really foresee the conclusion. And I'll admit again, with mystery books, I'm not sure if that's because of my incompetence or because of the way it was set up and portrayed to the reading audience. I didn't figure it out. And I wasn't really too torn up about it either. So overall, I definitely want to say this would be a buy it. I'm a little curious to see how this series maybe started off, but I could probably pass without feeling bad about it. So I would say this might be a borrow it. Your sense of humor might be very different. I would expect it to be very different from mine. I tend to have a very dry sense of humor. Excuse me. So you might pick this up and think that it is quite hilarious. You might enjoy the protagonist's antics and everything else that comes along with it. Some of the side characters, again, I thought they were acceptable. I didn't find them to be annoying, but they weren't tickling my ribs either. So I'd say borrow it. That'd be my ultimate recommendation. But anyways, I hope you've had... Pardon me. I hope you enjoyed this book discussion, and have a good one, folks. See ya.